get started. My name's Todd Williams. I'm the president of Fidelity, and again, just want to welcome everybody and say thank you. It's a nice event today, and hope that you can take some time afterwards and do a little networking and have a drink. I kind of look around, and if it was 2 days ago, I think probably this room would be half full, and we'd probably be in shorts. But the weather seems like it's coordinating exactly what you would expect in Minnesota. But anyway, the topic today is uncertainty, and I think I kind of go back last fall. And I was going out on meetings and talking with various companies. And one thing that was happening is, you know what, we're having a hard time getting materials. And on top of that, labor is hard to find. And oh, by the way, I'm purchasing as much inventory as I can, and it's maybe a year's worth. And I actually had one client who bought a whole year's worth of inventory, and he said, hey, I made 250 grand just by buying it early. And so I'm like, you know, something's going on here. And I think it's probably a product of a lot of liquidity in the market. And then we probably got into January, and then I got familiar with a term, which was, well, now we're going on to this liftoff. Liftoff? Well, interest rates. And I'm like, you know what? I'm a product of you know, the 80s, 90s, but since 2000, we really haven't seen a big increase in interest rates. But they're saying we're starting to head in a time of a liftoff. So I took that term and kind of brought it back to the bank. And what I thought was a liftoff was probably 2 percentage points. And we did our budget. And then, oh my gosh, you know what? It's going to be a little bit longer, a bigger liftoff than we thought. So we get to the summer, and I'm kind of talking to a number of people that went through the 70s. And I said, well, hey, these are some of the scenarios that I've seen, and I haven't lived through this. And he gave me a scenario where, you know, we bought a lot of inventory and we couldn't find people. But what we found is at some point, the people in front of us decided that there was enough inventory. And so then it seemed to slow down at one point until they burned off their inventories. And I was on a call last week, and it's funny is this manager, he goes, well, you know what? We're in a reset. And I'm like, oh, that's the first time I've ever heard of a reset. It was a liftoff, and now I'm learning about a reset. Well, the reset was their clients were starting to reset their inventories based upon what they had, and maybe they'd be working them on. So I look at the uncertainty right now because there's a lot of good things in our clients, and you see a lot of growth, and everybody's scrambling for labor, but there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of things that, and especially in the last 20 years, we just haven't seen. So I think when we're in a group like this, I think we can share stories and kind of get an idea of what's really going on in the economy. And then also we have a great panel today, which can give you their insights. But Fidelity is just like our clients. We're a small business, and we're all going through this together. And again, hey, we're here to support you and really appreciate you being here and really appreciate the business. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Todd. You know, I don't know about you, but I love fall. One of the reasons I love fall is that it's football season. I played a lot of football growing up, and in high school I remember coming home one Friday night after a game where we suffered a devastating loss to our crosstown rivals, the Staples Motley Cardinals. I grew up in Wadena, which is a very small town in west central Minnesota, but you know, go Wolverines. As I walked in the door, I noticed my dad sitting on the couch. I knew he wanted to talk football. I set down my backpack and plopped down on the couch next to him, and he asked me the same question he always asks. What'd you think of the game? I proceeded to complain about the ball being wet due to the rain, how our offensive coordinator made some poor play calls, and on and on. My dad listened patiently and then asked, Ryan, have you considered focusing less on that which you can control and more on what you can, like your attitude and effort? Ooh, that hurt. Over the past couple of years, my dad's words have come to my mind numerous times. Few have faced greater uncertainty and uncontrollables than you, business leaders and owners. All you have to do is pick up your phone and read about rising rates, record inflation, labor shortages, and supply chain constraints. So the question becomes, what can you control? Today we've assembled a panel of leaders in supply chain, talent, and finance to share their expertise. And our goal is that you walk away with one or two new ideas that you can implement in your business to help you navigate this financial uncertainty. Specifically, I'll be asking the panelists to consider three big questions. How do we get here? Where are we headed? And most importantly, the controllables, what can we do? Following questions, I'll open it up for Q&A, but now it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists. Dan Annunziata is a third-generation supply chain professional. Dan brings a lifetime of supply chain insight to his role as a leader at C.H. Robinson. Dan has been Vice President of North American Surface Transportation at C.H. Robinson for the past 3 years. Dan is responsible for leading the field sales organization as well as developing the strategy to transform sales processes, lead delivery, talent development, and market outreach. As an executive team member, he drives the company's divisional and enterprise go-to-market strategy, including new product and service development. Dan joined C.H. Robinson in 2008. Additional positions with the company that he's held include regional sales director, general manager, and sales manager. Dan's notable accomplishments while at C.H. Robinson include co-authoring C.H. Robinson's sales process and being responsible for roughly a $2 billion revenue organization within inside the company. Steve Schad has been helping businesses with talent strategies that grow results and profits for over 25 years. His firm, Optima Advisory, partners with small and mid-sized businesses to attract, retain, grow, and engage the best people so their clients can compete and win. Over his career, he's worked across industries and sectors to deliver proven organizational and HR best practices, both internally as an HR executive in manufacturing at Anderson Windows, and externally as an advisor and outsourced HR provider. The Optima team comprises experienced HR executives who serve as fractional HR leaders in small companies and other HR project and advisory specialists to support companies of all sizes. Ken Sadler continues to build on his 33 years of wide-ranging financial and business leadership experience. While operating in various large manufacturing and consumer products concerns, he successfully built and led exemplary financial and IT organizations with 4 different public corporations over the course of his 20-year career before joining B2B CFO. During his corporate career, Ken has held positions ranging from entry-level financial analyst to SVP of Finance, IT and Business Insights, and Global Director of Finance and Planning while encompassing domestic and international responsibilities. Ken has 22 years of experience in the CFO seat at different companies ranging in size from $1 million in revenue to nearly $2 billion. He's best known for passionately helping companies to improve profitability and cash flow, dramatically increase business value, and eventually successfully navigate them through a transition and liquidity event at maximum value. Please welcome our panel. So gentlemen, let's get started with the big question that's on all of our minds that we've all been reading about for the last couple of years. And Dan, I'm going to start with you. From your perspective as a supply chain and logistics leader, what happened in sort of your realm, if you will?
Well, happy to be here. Thanks for having us. You can really go back to, from a supply chain perspective, almost the first couple days of the pandemic and go back to what happened. And what was interesting back then is if you could go back to the frantic need for PPE, and 95% of the world's PPE is produced in the Wuhan region. So you saw an immediate reaction in the market to get as much PPE out of that as possible. So you think about the movement of supply, whether it be ocean containers, airlines, trucks, whether from overseas to all over the world, really. So that was the first kind of shock to the system. And then within immediately after that, you saw things like the automotive sector completely shut down and just supply chains completely stopped and trucks not move at all. You saw some of the largest swings from a cost perspective in terms of sort of surface transportation here in North America, and then quickly thereafter on container rates from China and overseas that we've never historically seen. You've kind of seen that in the news. And you can really pinpoint back to right at the beginning of the pandemic that the PP was a shock to the system. There was an immediate reaction then from companies essentially thinking that we're going to be entering a deep recession, and immediately started making decisions on inventory and how their transportation was organized. And it was a continuous shock to the system that you've kind of took us, and I think a lot of people, I always joke, at least at home, that my grandmother knew about supply chain because of the pandemic, because it went from being something that you didn't really talk about to every day you had somebody on CNBC or the news talking about supply chain and where's my stuff. And you couldn't even, I mean, you go back and think about it, it feels like an eternity ago, but even just the ship getting stuck in the canal, like, I mean, unprecedented things continued to happen in transportation, and it was wild swings in supply and demand. And companies essentially didn't know how to navigate. Many companies like ourselves didn't even know how to navigate some of that environment. So I mean, what happened was we have a delicate balance of supply and demand in transportation, and I mean a super fine line, like decimal points, and it shocked the system to the point of we're still recovering from it today. And it's hard to say when they'll get back to the new normal, but we're still dealing with a lot of what happened back in 2020.
So the headline from a labor perspective is really just demographics. And I liken it to I mean, it's a ship, right? If you've ever seen a ship crash into a dock, one of those big ocean liners, it's slow, but it's devastating. It just crushes the dock as it plows into it. And it's kind of what's happening with demographics in the United States. You've got a number of dynamics that are within that. So you've got the obvious one of retirements and people reaching retirement age, and the largest population part that we have in boomers. But then there's other dynamics at play as well. So after the last recession, we're still feeling the effects of 2008 because the labor force participation rate dropped, and it has been dropping really since the early 2000s. And so when you think about what happened from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the labor force participation rate started to go up, and it went up, and it continued to go up until the early 2000s. And that was driven by more and more people coming into the workforce, including women. And so you had lots and lots of labor. And what's been happening since the early 2000s is that's shifted. And so now you've got people dropping out of the workforce, primarily due to retirement. But you also have people who are opting out. So when you had people who were kind of entering into the workplace to add income to their homes and their families, now you have people who are withdrawing and they're adjusting their lifestyle expectations. So they're less driven to work than they were a generation ago. So that's a very interesting dynamic. We also have immigration has historically been at about 1 million people coming into the United States every year. And that is, over the last 5 years, has dropped significantly as well. So there's not consensus on how to deal with that. So that's affecting us as well. And then also at a macro level, you've got shifts are happening as younger generations are coming into the workplace, their attitudes about work are naturally changing. And so their expectations of the workplace are very different than what most of the people in this room grew up with. And so now we have to unlearn what we learned over the course of our careers and figure out how do we create an environment for employees that have very different expectations. And so those are a few of the things that at a big level are really harming us. And so as we try to get people back into the workplace, we're finding that there just aren't enough people there. And what's challenging for us as we talk about what's coming next is that there isn't really anything that's going to shift that. So we have really a new reality that has come at us at the time of the pandemic. And the final thing I'll say is during the pandemic, now we have Gen Z has entered the workforce at the same time that the pandemic was happening. So my oldest daughter is 19, so she's part of that Gen Z generation that's coming into the workplace. And they have their own unique set of challenges. And there's nothing really different about generations other than what's happening around them in the world. For the millennials, what was happening in the world was 9/11, school shootings, things like that were coming to the fore in the news at that time. Now it's a pandemic, and it's happening in a world where people's lives are online. And so we have to figure out as employers what to do with that, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the content.
Is mine working? I think I'm okay, yeah. So, when I think about this question, what happened, it's been a long time since I took a macroeconomics course in my undergrad, but when you step back and you think about those simple economic lessons, I mean, that's what happened, supply and demand. In a very short period of time, we asked everybody worldwide to stay home and purchase very little. And supply slowed, but not as quickly as demand did. And then all of that whipped around very quickly. And so it's not surprising that we've seen, I guess the one thing that's more evident than ever is just the interconnectedness of the global economy. I mean, if you didn't think it was before, I mean, we've had so many lessons provided to us. And so naturally, we had this extreme inflation, and all the things that came with it. So it really was kind of an economics lesson. And then you throw in a conflict in Eastern Europe that, didn't help matters either. And I kind of looked at it and said, yeah, here we are. It's actually pretty straightforward from that regard. So then I thought, well, okay, what have I seen happen with my clients? So I made a little list here, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of head shaking going up and down here. So all of my clients in the last year plus have suffered from some of these to some degree. So double-digit cost inflation, skyrocketing salaries, and ultimately the Great Resignation. If anybody doesn't know what that is, I'm sure, Steve, you could talk about that for long periods of time. Then having to deliver price increases to your customers to try to maintain margins, because if you don't, your margins suffer greatly. Foreign vendors, overtaxed by the unleashed demand, experienced significant quality headaches, and in the process impacted their importers and customers, in some cases in an extreme way. Talked about transportation and delivery slowdowns, followed by sudden inventory buildups. Rapidly increasing costs of capital, Todd referred to that. And then finally, this year, I've had two, I'm done with this, I don't want to deal with it anymore, leading to sales of the business. So it's been a whirlwind, but basically an economics lesson, a lot of things that we can't control. So hopefully we can spend the rest of the time talking about some of the things that we can control.
Thanks, Ken. Before we get there, I'd just be interested in your thoughts, gentlemen, on where you think we're headed, again, sort of in your area of expertise. Dan, let's come back to you.
Well, this year has definitely been a tale of a couple different years and a couple different markets. So as we entered this year, we assumed it to be a constrained market still, where there was going to be more demand and there was supply in the market. across the major modes of global supply chain. So you think about ocean and then here, which is surface transportation or truck. You really had a constrained market for the better part of the last 3 years, which led to those obscene cost of transportation over the last handful of years and unprecedented costs that we have never seen. So we've seen that over the last 6 months fall off the cliff, and that's been on the news of late. If you've seen container pricing from Baseport, China to West Coast, U.S., it's gone from $20,000 per container a year ago to under $3,000 as of Monday this week. So you can imagine just the swing of that and the economic impacts and the P&L and the financial impacts that companies and corporations have had to endure. So it's actually a good time for businesses, large and small and medium, all different sizes. As you think about where we're headed, it's a good time to reset transportation and supply chain. As you think about your organization, so much has changed over the last 3 years in terms of your businesses, in terms of where you buy materials from and suppliers. Customer basis has changed. There's been organizations in transportation that have new entrants to the marketplace. Just all in all, it leads to a good time to be evaluating this portion of your business because there's probably a better mousetrap out there just with technology advancing inside of the transportation space at the rate it is. We're definitely headed in a more favorable environment for the shipper. So if you are shipping stuff, the expectation is that costs should continue to come down. I would tell you that you should expect that into next year. We have a handful of data scientists and economists on staff over at C.H. Robinson, and we are predicting a freight recession because of the dynamics of the recessionary environment that we are seeing out there, which should lead and would lead to lower and hopefully better costs than you've had to pay over the last handful of years. So the outlook is still choppy, but there is light at the end of the tunnel from a transportation cost perspective. We hosted a customer event about a month ago over at Eden Prairie, and then have been hosting them all over the country. And a sentiment from most of the people that we work at, the organizations that we do, which is a wide array of organizations, from large to our base being really in the medium small sector, that they're expecting and they're holding their transportation budgets accountable to serious cost increases. So not only are we predicting costs to continue to come down, but as finance organizations and supply chains really moved into the boardroom, because it has caused so much pain for organizations, is the expectation is that transportation costs should and will come down in the future. So as we think about where we're headed, there is some light on the cost side of things for all of you, but then I would tell you the other unknowns in some of the industries, you've heard this, is probably a driver shortage. We've been talking about driver shortage for about 10 years now. And in a market where it's more shipper favorable, as we really don't have any capacity constraints, but it is something that we will continue to deal with. It's not the most favorable job. It's got an aging population, and that's really that population that's aging and moving into retirement is the actual target audience that we're recruiting for truck drivers. So it's not a very fruitful pool of candidates. They've looked at different states have looked at lowering the age to be able to drive a truck to 18. Obviously, some people have concerns about an 80,000-pound truck rolling down the street with an 18-year-old behind the wheel, so that's going to be something that will have to work its way through legislation. But then you also have the influence of autonomy come into play. So we actually have run a handful of loads, a couple thousand now, with a driver in the cab but not hands on the wheel. So that's definitely an influence that is coming, but that will take some infrastructure work to it as well. So there's some influences to that, but all in all, like I said, the environment isn't any smoother. There's definitely some chop out there, but there is light at the end of the tunnel from a cost and a capacity perspective from a shipper base.
What, first off, I think Steve's daughter's looking for a job. She's 19.
Yeah, you don't want her driving a truck.
So Dan, what role do you see electric vehicles and or driverless vehicles playing, and what's sort of the time horizon on that?
Electric, definitely sooner than autonomous, so we can go deep into autonomous trucking, but there's different levels of autonomy. There's essentially person in cab, hands on wheel, all the way to nobody in cab, similar to car technology. We've recently partnered with Waymo, which is an Alphabet company, because they're essentially running car, like Uber, Lyft type car services with no driver in the Phoenix area. So we've partnered with them. We believe autonomy, I mean, anywhere from, and so those different levels of autonomy will hit us at different times over the course of the next, really, every year essentially. But one big investment would be for autonomous trucks to be a legitimate part of our supply chain is that we're gonna have to have infrastructure work. So platooning is essentially, it's like a truck, but it acts like a train on a road. It has special like designations in terms of markings. So and you can do it in corridors, so long corridors, or like you think about big transportation hubs of like Dallas to Atlanta. So there is some infrastructure work that comes into it. In terms of electric, I think electric's, I mean, there's a lot of work around even the big players in automotive that are coming out with their electric trucks, but then also, I mean, the Teslas of the world, and a lot of energy and funding around electric. So those are two major influencers. A little bit unknown of how fast some of them influence the industry, but they will be major influencers over the next 10 years.
Thank you.
So he was talking about light at the end of the tunnel. In terms of population, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. So we just have to accept that as a reality and figure out what to do about it, because we're not going to control it. We'll get to what we can control. But if you look at the demographics, in the next 10 years, the population that is 16 to 24 years old, so those are the people 10 years from now, they're 6 to 14. So in the next 10 years, that population is going to be flat. That means that it's basically the same number entering that age group as is entering that age group today. At the same time, there are going to be 15 million people entering retirement in the next 10 years. So, and that's 15 million more than what we have entering retirement today. So the labor situation is not going to change. There would have to be, and we have lowering birth rates are going down. There's no end in sight to the labor participation rate. And I use that term, what that means is the people who can work, who are 16 and older, are in the workforce, and includes retirees. So that rate is not going to change probably either, okay? And unless we get some kind of breakthrough and there's a miracle and we have consensus on immigration, there's no really signs that that's gonna change either. So in terms of where we're headed, that's a storm that's probably not going to change. But at the same time, the light in that tunnel is really coming from other places. And so automation is a huge thing, right? Autonomous trucks is a form of automation that's happening, and if you're running a business that makes things, you should be looking at automation for everything that you do. And if you're not doing automation, you should be implementing lean, you should be stripping waste out of your system so that you can reduce the need for people. The other thing that is, that's a part of this scenario of kind of solutions, I guess, is how do you get people who either haven't or traditionally you wouldn't expect to do the kind of work that you need done, how do you pull them into your labor force? So for example, are there disabled people that could be doing some of the work in the organization? Can you think differently about how work gets done? The trend that happened with offshoring that happened in the 1990s and early 2000s, that's kind of played itself out, but it really didn't touch small businesses. And so small businesses may be looking at opportunities to reduce their labor costs by looking to get work done in different locations where the cost of labor is lower. So it's going to be a period of creativity in trying to figure out how to run business. And that's the key thing is, do you have the creative muscle in your organization to figure out solutions to these problems because they're pretty thorny. I mean, they're not things that are easily solved. Businesses have to get everything right in terms of how they run the business and manage people. I'll talk about that more in terms of what you can do. And I think there's an I view it as an acceleration of this shift in attitudes about work. If you think about what's happening here, you have the boomers, you have the greatest wealth transfer ever is about to happen. You have all this wealth is gonna pass from boomers to Gen X and millennials. And so the whole motivation for work is different than it was 50 years ago, 60 years ago. I remember my dad doing his job, right? He worked because he absolutely had to put food on the table. And that's not the same calculus in people's minds with young people today. And we can criticize that, but we can also accept it and just say, look, they are motivated by different things. You have to understand those motivations and what do you do about it. That's what's shifting. And as Gen Z comes into the workplace, the things that we saw in the millennial generation are really amplified with that generation. And there was a statistic I saw that I just got this today. In 2021, 44% of high school students said they were persistently sad or hopeless in the past year. They had feelings of persistent sadness or hopelessness in the past year. Now there's one reaction is you kind of have the tough guy response. You're like, well, suck it up, buttercup, right? It's like, that's one way of responding. The other thing is, you would think, well, maybe they were just sheltered. What they were talking about that in the context of is kids are full from morning to night on everything that they do, and they actually feel a lot of anxiety about getting everything done. So it's not that they don't like to work or don't want to work or get anxious when they have to leave the house, it's that there's so much pressure on them to move through life that it just feels at times they just can't get over the anxiety. And then layer into that the things that are happening around them and concerns about things that we may or may not be concerned about, but what's happening in the environment, what's happening with school shootings and those sorts of things, those anxieties just pile on. So whether you agree with whether they should be anxious or not, they're feeling that anxiety. And so how is that going to show up in the workplace? What does that mean for us as employers as we think about building a workforce for the future? Those are things that we really have to understand. So where we're headed is there's a lot more psychology at work that's going to have to be in play. We have to understand that psychology and be able to respond to it. And there are practical things you can do in that regard.
So I didn't spend a ton of time on this, but I think it's pretty clear we're in some version of a correction or a recession already. And I'm not going to get in the business of predicting how long it'll take to recover from that. I mean, there's a lot of smarter people than me who, try to predict those things and they're always wrong. So I won't try either. But, I think we just have to be prepared. There's going to be a rough patch, at least in the, next year. But I don't know how long. If you're not feeling it, you will be soon. You just can't have all this uncertainty hit the economy at the same time and have it not affect the macro economy. So I don't think that's going away. These things always have a way of correcting themselves because we have a great economy over the long haul. The financial markets have already priced it in. We know that. Have we hit the bottom of that? Who knows? Another thing, I'm not in the business of predicting, but I get asked all the time too. But I definitely don't have that one on my resume either. So inflation has proven sticky, right? I mean, I agree. Obviously, the freight costs are starting to come down, and you're starting to see some of those macroeconomic factors ripple through the marketplace. FedEx laying off. I mean, so that's good. So there is some easing there, and I think we've seen, I'm going to say from about the middle of 2021 to the middle of 2022, this just nonstop cost increases coming through. That has slowed down. Obviously, the Fed's activities to restrict the constrictive financial policy measures they continue to put in place, not sure they're done, those are starting to have effect. So all these things are starting to come to bear, and capital is getting squeezed. I believe Fidelity Bank might still be lending though, if they're not gonna stop doing that. But it is getting more expensive, obviously, in this interest rate environment. So it may not be over. Something I've learned recently, though, that's interesting is, for years you heard about all this idle capital that was in private equity. It's still there. In fact, I learned yesterday that, or a couple days ago, that people are starting to divest in private equity a bit because they're frustrated that their money's been there, sitting there idly for so long. So there is still capital available in the world on people's balance sheets. That hasn't changed. So I don't know what that means. I think I'm always a fan of the best capital you can ever have is the capital that you generate yourself. That's what I try to help companies do, is to not rely on outside capital.
That's a bad idea.
Yeah, I know. I knew that one wasn't going to be popular with the hosts here, but so I'm starting to jump into what can we do, but
I think that's perfect, go ahead. Yeah, that's perfect.
I think there's a period of uncertainty for sure that's coming, and it's not going to go away. But again, everything I've just talked about for the most part are things that you can't control. So I love the way Ryan started the deal. I actually once wrote back when I was doing constant contact articles, when I was trying to get people to talk to Ken Sadler, I wrote an article called "Control What You Can Control." So I'm loving that. Shouldn't we all do that? So what would I say? Well, to a certain extent, live in the present moment. I have a saying that over a 35-year career, I've developed that calm always wins. It's easy to get caught up when everyone around you has their hair on fire. So with that said, though, you got to have an eye on the future. So build a cash flow forecast and have it based on your expectations for the business. So plan, document, and then build your projections to meet those goals. And it might seem simple, but you and your management team every month should be thinking about what did we plan to have happen and what happened, and talking about it and adjusting. So that's what I mean by live in the present moment. Know your costs and I think it's going to get easier to know your costs than it has been in the past year. I don't expect the labor inflation, I think, might not be gone, but just right down the middle, we're hearing some relief on freight costs. We're not going to continue to see 8, 10, 12% cost increase, but spend the time to really understand what it takes to get your cost or to get your product or your service to the marketplace. That is extremely valuable, and you learn a lot from it. And then don't let the inflation impact your margins. I have watched where it's oh gosh, everybody else is taking price increases. I can tell you, I've been doing this for so long now, with 100% certainty, I can tell you there's a price opportunity in every business. And I don't mean you just go out and take your prices up 10% to all your clients, but if you're willing to be analytical about it, sometimes even that's necessary, because you haven't done it in a while. But every business has a price opportunity somewhere in there, and now's the time. You still have a window of time, based on the conditions, to say we need to talk about our price. So pay close attention to your margins, but be opportunistic with it too. Conserve cash. It never hurts to have a rainy day fund. I get a lot of funny looks when I say that, but when things like this happen, it's nice to have a rainy day fund. And like I said, the best capital, Ryan and Todd might disagree with me, is what you generate. It's little things like that inventory that's been sitting on your balance sheet for years. Go sell it. Well, I'm only going to make 35% on what I paid for it. Well, it's not doing anything for you sitting in the warehouse. In fact, it's generating costs in your business that you don't need. So go sell it. So I will now talk out of the other side of my mouth. You can be prudently aggressive. I had a mutual client here with the bank that 2 years ago, right in the middle of the pandemic, he learned that a competitive business was having some difficulties with their bank, and they were going to put the business on the market. So he preemptively called, it was an equity firm out in New York, And one thing led to another. He bought an extremely valuable piece of business for a good price, just killed it with this business in addition to the rest of his business throughout 2021. And he was one of the ones who said, I'm done with this, I've had it with the great resignation and everything else, and he sold his business back in June for a very good number. But a big chunk of his 2021 EBITDA came from that acquisition we made when this company was panicking, the bank was calling, and he made hay in a really difficult situation. So that acquisition that you've been thinking about making, you might want to find out what the price is today. So be aggressive when you can. Obviously, you want to have, you want to make sure it has the good return on investment, but now might be a time to be a little more aggressive. Challenge all your expenses. I mean, I think that's always a good idea, just to go through and review your insurance and your travel and all the little things that add up. And then a couple, I guess I'll call them non-financial. Run your business, don't let it run you. I think we all would do well, and I remind myself about this sometimes, just what is it, why are we valuable to our customers? Why do they pay us to do what we do? And remember that, and that should be the purpose of your business. I've been reading the book, I don't know if anybody's read it, it's actually like a 10-year-old book, it's called Conscious Capitalism, but Ray Mackey is the author, he's the founder of Whole Foods, and he keeps throughout the book talking about stay true to your purpose, and everybody involved in your business, your customers, your vendors, your obviously yourself, everybody who touches your business should know what that purpose is and stay true to it now. And I think in times like these, it's a really good idea to remind yourself and everybody, all the stakeholders in your business, what is the purpose? Because if you are really good at your purpose, some of these other things are going to take care of themselves. So those are my thoughts on what we can do.
Thanks, Kevin.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Yeah, that's gonna help with your employees too. I mean, that sense of purpose is something that creates meaning at work. One of the things that you can do, one of the very practical things you can be doing now is planning. When we got to the recession in 2008, Anderson Windows had been in it for 2 years by the time the financial markets got into it. And when you have to lay people off, it's never fun to do, but I bet everybody in this room knows 2 or 3 people, maybe one, in their organization that maybe should be let go. So lay the groundwork now, be thinking about how am I gonna make those changes when the time comes for it, so that you've laid the groundwork and you don't have to, you wanna be in a defensible position. That's the policy or the HR rules and regulations side of me. I don't have much of that, because I'm more on the other end of HR. But one of the things that I would suggest is things that used to be nice to have in terms of how you provide an experience for your employees. So sometimes you could say, hey, we're great on benefits, or we're great on salary, or we're great on the family feel of the organization. We got a great culture. You really have to do well on everything versus doing well on a couple things. So because there's a company around the corner that is doing well on everything, and they're gonna come for your people. So you've got to really hit on all cylinders in what I term the employee experience. And the employee experience is simply how employees view working at your organization. And in the 2000s, we talked about engagement. We want employees who are engaged, because people who are engaged, they give more effort and they stay longer. So that's really what you're after. You want engagement. And the problem that you're experiencing right now is that the power dynamic has shifted. Up until this period in time, businesses really called the shots. Business owners and executives kind of had all the cards. And that has now shifted. So companies that weren't worried about the employee experience now have to be very worried about the employee experience. Because your employees have to want to work for you if they're going to stay. So what are you doing around that? Rethink work and streamline processes. So I talked about this earlier in terms of automation. If it's office work, get it into a computer. If it's manufacturing work, have robotics on the shop floor. The cost of robotics is coming down pretty dramatically over the last 3 to 5 years. It's now very much in reach. And you can have, I forget the term of it, but it's something that will sit next to a worker and augment their work versus something that will totally replace a worker. You've got a range of options. So you should be looking at ways that you can take labor out of your business. And that should be one of your key goals. Think about ways that you can tap into labor like a fractional CFO, right? There's a point in time when an organization gets big enough and sophisticated enough when they have to have functional heads that are full-time employees of your organization. Until you get to that size, you really should be looking at fractional support in different areas. And it's not self-serving, it's a logical way of thinking about your business and saying, okay, what work has to get done and how do I get that work done? And work back on that kind of line of reasoning.
Well, if you can't hire somebody, what are you gonna do, right? I mean, if you can't find an employee for a position, you have to find a way, and you're saying it's gonna shrink on us.
Yeah, it is.
It's continuing to shrink.
So think about, there may be somebody in New York who could get the work done here. Think about ways that you can find labor somewhere else if you can't find it here. Think about part-time jobs. At Anderson, we would not be able to hire somebody who was a part-time working parent going to school, because we had rotating shifts every 2 weeks. You would have to go on to you would end up on a different shift, and you couldn't maintain a predictable lifestyle. We had job requirements in our job descriptions that said you have to have a college degree for jobs that didn't require a college degree. We put all sorts of barriers in place, really unknowingly, unthinkingly, as organizations that keep people out of our organizations. Tap new sources of talent. There's, remember I talked about the labor force participation rate? All that means is that's a number above a number. And the number of people that are not working, there's people there who could be working. So if you can figure out why they're not working and figure out a way to get them into your business, that's going to be a golden ticket. So think about the people, the retirees. Is there work in your organization that could be done by retirees without threatening whatever benefits or income that they have? Is there work that could be done by somebody who is maybe disabled? Can you reapportion work? In the old way, we would think about jobs and full-time roles, 8-hour-a-day jobs that had to be filled. If you switch your thinking to what work needs to get done, now you can think about matching skill and ability to work versus person to role. That gives you more granularity in your business so that you can get the things done with part-time or fractional or whatever types of labor. So that's what I mean by this kind of creativity that has to come in as a business owner. And can you really think differently about your organization, how the work gets done, and to really optimize it so that you can take that full-time, shrink your core, take the full-time labor out of your organization that you can, and that's how you're going to be able to navigate these times that are coming at us.
To echo a lot of the same sentiments, it's definitely in building off my last comments around a market shift in transportation. What you can do now is inspect your business. It's a very good time to look under the cover and understand how your supply chain works today and why it works the way it does. And there's lots of free opportunities to get whether it's process assessments or just general pricing engagements out in the marketplace. There's more price transparency in our space than there ever has been. So it's a very good time to be evaluating the way that your business works today. There's lots of different technologies out there that generally had not been affordable at the small and medium-sized businesses. As you think about TMSs, ERPs, and the ability to leverage connectivity across those different systems. So for small and medium-sized shippers, access to technology is greater than it ever has been before at a more affordable rate. So a lot of conversation generally around build versus buy. There's stuff off the shelf, technology off the shelf now. It's very easy to implement into your business that helps run your business more appropriately. But from what you can do today is we have advised at our recent clients study or engagements is it's a great time to evaluate. And it's a good time to make sure you're using the right providers, and that you have the right pricing and rate structure in your transportation, because the market has changed so much over the last 3 years as it's moved up and down. We do think that there's a sustained period of softening and price opportunity for shippers out there. So it's generally a good time to be asking why we do business with these providers and these vendors, and it's just a good time to be investigating your business. From a similar conversations here, from a labor perspective, we generally see a lot of opportunities in this type of market where companies are looking to leverage more of a managed transportation or managed outsource type solution, where instead of having the employees focus or sit on your P&L, essentially they're sitting on a transportation provider's P&L. So you generally see a big shift in organizations focusing on their core and outsourcing functions like transportation, and access to technology has made that even easier of late. So that's definitely a trend, is as you think about how your cost structure is set up against executing your business strategy, and supply chains generally, and transportation costs are generally one of the higher items on your cost side. It is good to look at how you apply people and technology inside of your transportation, because there's generally a couple people inside of that there's opportunity to leverage technology better than historically companies have. So to summarize it, it's inspect, look under the hood, inspect the business, understand why you're doing business with the people that you are doing business with, check the marketplace. There's a lot of providers out there with strong value propositions and competitive cost structures, and think about how you organize your people and technologies to potentially take out some waste inside of your supply chain.
Thanks, gentlemen. I have a lot of questions, but I imagine you do too, and so we're gonna take this opportunity to allow you to ask questions that you have for the panelists. I'll just ask you to speak as loudly as you can, and then I'll repeat the question and direct the question appropriately. So at this time, what questions do you have for the panel?
This is for Dan. Do your economic analysts and data analysts have any thoughts on how hard the landing is going to be for recession, how hard it's going to hit?
So the question was, do your data analytics people have thoughts on how hard the landing is going to be?
So our work is primarily around the freight impacts to it, so less the general economics of it, more the freight impacts to it. But we do not suspect it to be a 2008 situation. We expect it to be a more of a blip on the map for a period of time. And I think there was an overall correction happening, so not a hard landing, but kind of uncertain between how soft and medium would potentially look like. From a freight standpoint, we're kind of already in a freight recession in terms of what we're seeing from a volume standpoint. Companies just aren't buying as much as they were buying before, so volumes have fallen off the cliff. The amount of some of the products that we were all buying because we were using them in our houses, because we were locked in our houses for 2 years, has fallen off the cliff, like personal fitness equipment. So there's definitely a softening. I think it's probably more in that soft to medium portion of it, but from a freight standpoint, we're already feeling like it's a freight recession.
Excellent. What other questions? Sir?
For the last several years, I guess, the younger generations, Generation Z, that's coming to market now, they've been able to get into the gig economy. I noticed that hasn't been mentioned too much to a high degree, but my understanding is that we're starting to see some layoffs and some regulations in regards to the gig economy, hopefully and potentially pushing them back out into real job scenarios. When that does happen, do you guys see the potential of wages going down? Because my understanding so far is that when you leapfrog to your next job, that employer was going to pay you a lot more than you were being employed just to get you through the doors. Is that going to remain the same in your estimations? I don't know who to pose this question to.
Yeah.
Or is that going to change when we start to see these mass layoffs, as in Amazon cutting 25,000 open positions, those types of things?
Great question. So just to repeat the question, if you didn't hear it, really around Gen Z, the gig economy, and what impact will that have on wages. It's interesting, I'm gonna hand this to Steve here in a moment, but I just read an article, and perhaps you did too, sir, around how the reclassification of employees is on the docket for these gig workers, where they now have to treat them like employees. We've got two really successful gig workers here, so I'm curious to see what you say.
Hopefully it doesn't put us out of business. You know, it's a good question. So I preparing for this, I was spending some time comparing what happened in 2008 to what we're dealing with right now. We have a client who, when we were early on in the relationship, is like, well, we'll just have a recession and the pendulum will swing in the other direction. I don't think it's going to swing that far. And the reason is because of the macro demographics that I was talking about. Those workers are already in the economy, they're just classified a different way. So you may be able to draw them in as full-time employees, but in the overall balance of worker versus work, it's not going to change the equation that much. So, and even if we have a hard recession, the number of jobs that we have open right now is twice what it was before the recession hit in 2008. And the unemployment rate is about a little more than half of what the unemployment rate was when the last recession hit. So there's a lot more, I call it wetlands, right? It sops up the excess water, right? And there's a lot of excess water that has to be sopped up. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of jobs out there, there's a lot of work that has to get done, and there just really isn't enough people to do it. And so that equation at a top level isn't going to change. So it will change in the short term. If we have a recession, we have high layoffs. But with 10 million open jobs in the United States right now, and we have, we're still adding jobs to the economy, and the unemployment rate hasn't shifted yet, but it will. My point is, there's a lot of ground that has to be covered in order for it to get to the point where we start to feel it economically with labor and the dynamics that you're talking about. But psychologically, expectations are shifting too. People are less willing to jump jobs now because of an impending recession. So you're gonna get some relief for a while, but it will come back when the economy gets back onto its footing. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with what you're saying. I just, again, it comes back down to macroeconomics, and this is a bit of an odd approach to a recession, if that's what it's gonna be, in that we really aren't seeing poor job numbers. We aren't seeing the unemployment rate yet. I agree, you're gonna have to, at least for short periods of time, but I think there's plenty of workers to go around for the work, even in a slowed down environment. I tend to agree with you.
The other thing, one more thing, I just wrote an article about this. Employers are hoarding workers. So they're actually gonna hang on to people during the recession. And I thought this was a weird new thing, but actually Mitt Romney's dad testified in Congress back in the 1940s about labor hoarding, because they were doing it back then when we were at the tail end of the World War II, and they didn't have enough workers. The companies were holding on to their labor so that they didn't have to go back and rehire them. So it's actually worth it to do a little bit of math on, is it worth it for me to hang on to the workers and coast through the recession and keep some excess labor if I don't need it, versus letting them go and then having to go to the market and rehire when everybody else is going to be rehired. So it's kind of a strategy decision you have to make there in terms of how you handle your workforce. So it'd be worth it to do some math to figure out what makes sense.
All right, thank you. Sir.
Yeah, I was encouraged to hear Steve talk about use of fractional employees. And I'll probably gonna take this time to do a little shameless plug for CLA and what we do at BizOps there. But, we found that when we go into a situation, a lot of times, 70% of what a controller does can normally be pushed down to the lower levels, right? So do you need that full-time controller, or can you get by with a fractional one and push that work down to a lower level, reduce the cost of your overall workforce? I think that's something in everybody's control to kind of take a look at every position within their company to be able to see if they can do that.
Yeah, good point, Dave. Really the comment there was around being able to push work down as opposed to having to hire up for it. I think that's a really good point. Did I see another hand over here?
I was just following up on what he was saying there. Which way would you lean as far as hoarding? If you were gonna lean one way or the other right now, which way would you lean?
So the
Hoard
question,
or hoard or lean? Yes.
great question. The question was, do you hoard or do you lean out on employees?
And I know there's a lot of different industries and whatnot, but just in general.
It depends. So, you know, it does kind of depend. I mean, it depends on your business and how hard it is to get the workers that you need and what opportunity there is in your business to take labor out of it, like I was describing. So that's a really hard question to answer without knowing more about the situation. What you would want to do is really understand what would be the carrying cost of that labor, you know, predict what the period of time we think this recession is going to last. So, you know, be generous on that in terms of how long it's going to last. And then think about what's been your average time to fill on openings that you've had, and what's the training time. And the other dynamic is that as you go deeper into the kind of skill set. When you're scraping workers into the workforce that don't have the training and background and skills, there's a training cost to that. So now if you're pulling people in that don't have the kind of industry experience that you need, they have retraining costs associated with them. So you really have to kind of break down what's the total cost of ownership, what's the total cost of acquisition of labor, and kind of do that analysis. And that's going to give you your CFO should be able to help you kind of do that analysis on the cost of your workforce. But you're going to have to look at, you know, how long does it take you to get people in your organization? And it's usually a pretty long time. And when you get people in, there's usually a pretty significant gap between what they know and can do versus what you need them to do in the job. And so those are all variables that you're going to want to take a look at. Sorry, I didn't really answer it, but
Great question.
I know you wanted one earlier.
Well, I just look at it as, I think we can all agree, the cost of a bad hire it's really unfathomable. If you think about the amount of resources that go into hiring somebody and then to have it fail shortly after, and that's where I think, you know, you look through your organization and you hoard the good people. Because if you lose a good person and then you have to find somebody who is at least as good as them, hopefully better, and that might take a couple iterations and all the cost and, you know, pain that your company can go through because of that, that's where I'd be focused. And that's where I'd be maybe hoarding. And I hate that word, but it's, I know what you're saying.
Another question, Matt.
I just wanted to add in, it was said earlier that you want to look under the hood, and if you have good people, keep them. But if you do not, or if you have any true fat that you could possibly trim, now would be the time to start thinking about that and setting yourself up so that you could trim them if the time comes, essentially. The incoming or inbound employees at this point, you will always be paying a higher salary, likely always be paying a higher salary than you are to that position currently. So that's not going to change anytime soon from my first question.
Yeah, great point. Point you reiterated, you know, really looking under the hood and evaluating. Sir in the back.
This is for Dan from Transportation Logistics. CH trained drivers. In commercial real estate, it's hard to even find truck driving schools anymore. More or less land or facilities for them. How are we gonna figure that one out before we go electric?
Are we doing anything to
Yeah,
help?
do you guys do anything to?
We do quite a bit with the driver community, being that we're essentially an in-between between a shipper and a carrier, matching that supply and the demand. So we range from helping with discounts on tires to fuel, working with companies on different types of bonuses and signing bonuses across their fleet. A lot of the reasons why truck drivers leave the industry actually is because transportation is very sub-optimized. And what I mean by that is they spend many nights away from home. They're going different directions, and just because things don't work perfectly, and they leave because it's not an ideal job. And some of what we're working with our carrier partners on is basically building a more dedicated and round-trip type environment that gets people home every night. So there's no necessarily recruitment efforts by us at C.H. Robinson, because we are a non-asset based provider. but we have two sides of our marketplace, and carriers are a big one, so we invest millions and millions of dollars a year to not only try to attract drivers, but make the job even better.
We've got time for one more. Jeff?
Maybe more of a comment, over to Steve, yesterday, I went up to, had to meet the guy from Duluth, and, coming from Minneapolis, where do you meet? Hinckley at Toby's, right?
Yeah, that's
At
right.
Toby's.
Cinnamon rolls?
Yeah, at the Toby's, on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, you cannot buy a hamburger or get a beer at Toby's, they've stopped. So they're reducing the need for labor, right? Do you have any other examples that you're seeing where companies are getting, I guess, creative and saying, we're gonna, instead of trying to find labor, we're gonna try to reduce our labor on certain days?
So the question was, there's not a lot of labor out there, in short. Is there any thoughts around customers you've seen, Steve, companies that are choosing to reduce their labor? About reducing their offering?
Yeah, I haven't seen much of that, so I don't have a good answer for that in terms of examples that I can think of. Maybe some of the other panelists do. More so I've seen it's been really applying the creativity to kind of maintain what they're offering to their customers, but get creative in bringing them in. So we had a client that was very purposeful about being a second chance employer, for example. And what that means is they advertise and they actively go out and pursue people that are coming out of the criminal justice system. And so you think about a company like Anderson Windows, we had a spreadsheet where all the different things in your background would be a red, yellow, green in terms of whether you would get hired by Anderson. And there were the things that were red were usually felony convictions, any kind of criminal past. This organization's bar is, we'll take you if you committed murder as long as it wasn't premeditated. And literally that is their policy. And so in order to do that, they had to do things differently in terms of how they managed their employees and how they treated them and how they supported them. Because somebody who comes into your organization that's coming out of the prison system doesn't come without some form of baggage. So they had to figure out how to deal with the baggage. And they did. And those employees are the most loyal employees that you will ever find. They will never leave that organization. And they're very valuable. So that's the kind of creativity that organizations are really thinking about, more so than maybe reducing their offerings is what I've seen.
I don't have a client experience, but I do have a personal experience. I went into, and this is, restaurant related, but I went into the Dunkin' Donuts in Chaska 2 days ago to get a coffee, and I was standing at the counter thinking this gal who was preparing coffee and whatever behind there was gonna wait on me, and she goes, "You need to go to the kiosk." So I went to the kiosk and put in my order and paid with a credit card, and I went over and there was my coffee, and so I'm sure they just can't get enough people to staff their shifts, so I think you're gonna be seeing more and more of that going on. I know kiosks aren't gonna work in every business, obviously, but I think we're gonna be seeing more and more of that, because they've been hit the hardest between the virus and everything else that happened in the restaurant and fast food world. They're struggling big time for, it's better to do a kiosk and shut the place down and get no revenue for the morning,
One last thing I'd add to what we've seen and what we've even done is we've partnered with more companies that have ancillary type customers of ours in whether it's technology or product, to just connect the dots across supply chain. And I'd tell you, as you think about your business too, is think about other companies as partners, potential partners, and not always having to own or build your own technology product, you name it. It's been something that we've been leveraging across. I mentioned Waymo as an example, looking at those ancillary type industries where you have potentially opportunities to partner with companies that have similar culture and ideas around business, and we've seen a lot of success around that for all size shippers and customers.
How about a round of applause for our panelists? Well, on behalf of Fidelity Bank, thanks again for coming. Please don't miss out on what, this was fabulous content. I also think the opportunity to meet some of your peers is perhaps the greatest opportunity you have in an event like this. So please stick around. We do have cocktails and some hors d'oeuvres. We'd love to mingle with you there. Thanks again.